Chapter 16, World War II, Part 2, America Enters the War. The Atlantic Charter. The Roosevelt-Churchill Conference of August 1941. Whereas America was still a country at peace, it had also become clear that the mood of the country was slowly shifting to the idea of giving support, exemplified in Lend-Lease, to the countries struggling to hold off the aggressions of fascism. Roosevelt decided it was time to discuss diplomatic goals, if not actual war goals, that America might hold in common with England. Thus, in mid-August of 1941, Roosevelt met with Churchill on a battleship anchored just off the Canadian coast to discuss broad principles or goals that they both wanted to see pursued in the struggles of the democracies against the dictatorships. A week later, Roosevelt sent a message to Congress in which he outlined the basic principles agreed on in this meeting with Churchill. Quote, "No territorial gains. First, their countries, the United States and Great Britain, seek no aggrandizement, territorial or otherwise. Territorial adjustments. Second, they desire to see no territorial changes that do not accord with the freely expressed wishes of the peoples concerned. Self-government. Third, they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live, and they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Equal access to world trade. Fourth, they will endeavor, with due respect for their existing obligations, to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, victor or vanquished, of access on equal terms to the trade and to the raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity. Economic cooperation. Fifth, they desire to bring about the fullest collaboration between all nations in the economic field with the object of securing for all improved labor standards, economic advancement, or social security. A post-Nazi peace. Sixth, after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, they hope to see established a peace which will afford to all nations the means of dwelling in safety within their own boundaries, and which will afford assurance that all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want. Freedom of travel on the high seas. Seventh, such a peace should enable all men to traverse the high seas and oceans without hindrance. General disarmament. Eighth, they believe that all of the nations of the world, for realistic as well as spiritual reasons, must come to the abandonment of the use of force. Since no future peace can be maintained if land, sea, or air armaments continue to be employed by nations which threaten or may threaten aggression outside of their frontiers, they believe, pending the establishment of a wider and permanent system of general security, that the disarmament of such nations is essential. They will likewise aid and encourage all other practicable measures which will lighten for peace-loving peoples the crushing burden of armaments. This Roosevelt-Churchill agreement was issued at first simply as a joint declaration on August the 14th, 1941. This was an amazing document, considering the fact that America was not officially at war with anyone at that point. Yet it clearly laid out war aims, in many ways resembling Wilson's 14 points, which he had hoped a generation earlier would direct warring parties to a new and just global peace. other countries adopt the principles of the Atlantic Charter. The following month, September, the document was put forward and unanimously adopted at a meeting in London of England and her wartime allies. The governments in exile of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and Poland, plus representatives from the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and the non-Vichy Free French representing Charles de Gaulle, as a basis of a common set of wartime goals. Thus, the agreement proved to be one of the first steps towards the formation of the United Nations, at that time describing only a grand military alliance. Also, by this time, the document was being referred to as the Atlantic Charter. Nazi reaction. The Axis powers interpreted these diplomatic agreements as a potential alliance against them. Adolf Hitler saw it as evidence of collusion between the UK and the USA in an international Jewish conspiracy. In the Japanese Empire, the Atlantic Charter rallied support for the militarists in the government, who pushed for a more aggressive approach to the UK and the US. The end of American neutrality. And at the end of October 1941, with the sinking of an American destroyer by a German submarine, the Neutrality Acts were finally repealed, and American warships were allowed to be armed and to transport war material to England. Growing tension with Japan. With France's fall to Germany in June of 1940 and the creation of the Vichy government in France, the French colony of Indochina was only weakly held by the French. The Japanese took advantage of this weakness, demanding of the Vichy government access to Indochina in order to move against the Chinese enemies in the south of China. America was alarmed by this expansion of Japanese power into Indochina, and in July decided to place an embargo on the sale of strategic goods, that is, aircraft parts, key minerals, oil, and scrap iron, to Japan, irritating Japan immensely. Plus, anti-Japanese racial attitudes reflected in American limits on Japanese immigration infuriated the Japanese military leaders who were suffering from some of the same racial illusions of greatness that had affected the Nazis. The Japanese military leaders, who dominated all Japanese politics at this point, were themselves divided on what to do about the American problem. Eventually, General Hideki Tojo and his group won the day with the help of the Emperor Hirohito, and readied Japan to deliver a huge crippling blow that they were certain would force America to have to sue for peace entirely on Japanese terms. The Japanese would take out the American naval fleet stationed at Pearl Harbor, destroying all American capabilities in the Pacific and Asia. At the same time, they would seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and all of the lands along the way, principally the American protected Philippines, independent Thailand, British Malaya, and the British naval base at Singapore. The French government at Vichy, forcibly allied with Hitler's Nazi Germany, had already given its permission to the Japanese to occupy French Indochina, that is, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Not all Japanese were certain that this plan would work. Notably, Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied for 2 years at Harvard, and who offered the opinion that if the strike did not work as planned, the endeavor would succeed only in awakening a sleeping lion, with dire results for Japan. Nonetheless, he submitted himself to the majority of his military colleagues and went along with the plan. a date which will live in infamy. Thus, at dawn on Sunday morning, December the 7th, 1941, without any declaration of war or any warning to the Americans, Japanese carrier-based airplanes attacked the Pearl Harbor Naval Station, sinking all the battleships anchored there and wiping out nearly all of the airplanes still parked at the air station. Footnote. Japanese civilian diplomats had been in Washington, claiming to want to negotiate an improvement in Japanese-American relations, when they were instructed instead to deliver a declaration of war. But they were still working on a translation of the declaration when the attack got underway in Hawaii. But the attack had an effect quite opposite what the Japanese had intended. Instead of forcing America to cringe before Japanese power, the attack pushed America overnight to a willingness to become a dedicated fighting nation. On the following day, December the 8th, Roosevelt stood before Congress to request a declaration of war against Japan. His speech was unlike Wilson's 1917 speech with its ringing statement of high ideals, which the Americans by this time are highly suspicious of, but a simple reference to the criminality of Japan's behavior, has begun simply with the statement, quote, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan," unquote. Roosevelt mentioned the treachery of the Japanese in pretending to be negotiating for peace when in fact Japan had already decided days before to attack America. He did not gloss over the huge loss of life and military equipment and pointed out that this was part of a wider Japanese aggression, tied with an attack in the Philippines and other areas in the Pacific. His appeal was strictly to the sense of national outrage and to the American spirit that would never let Japan get away with such treachery. Thus, and we quote, "As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense. But always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us, no matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion. The American people, in their righteous might, will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the utmost, but will make it a very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces and with the unbounded determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God." A readiness to get the job done. There it was, plainly said, we Americans would fight, not to save the world for some kind of high ideal, but rather to defend ourselves from the treachery that threatened us, our territory, our interests. It was a hard and precise piece of political realism, and we were ready to back that declaration with our lives, so help us God. Congress's vote for war was unanimous in the Senate and only one vote short, liberal feminist Jeannette Rankin opposed, of being unanimous in the House. At 4 p.m. on the 8th of December, America was formally at war, though at this point only against the Japanese. Hitler declares war on America. Several days later, puffed up with his growing sense of military genius, announced that he was respecting the tripartite pact with Japan in declaring that a state of war now existed between Germany and the United States. So whatever America's hesitant feelings had been previously about the war in Europe, they no longer mattered. By Hitler's own bizarre decision, America was at war not only with the Japanese, but also with the Germans. With God's help, we will triumph. And this was not a good time for America to be getting into a war against two successful empires. With few proven allies for America to count on, France had been knocked out, England and Russia were not looking very good at this point, and America's own military was in deplorable state of unpreparedness. But the spirit of America in 1941 was such that Americans chose not to look at the situation as worldly eyes would see things, well, very bad indeed, but as the higher vision, as God might see things, the need to take a stand against evil, and trust in God to support us in our struggle. When Roosevelt added the words, "So help us God," at the end of his address, requesting of Congress a declaration of war, that was not merely religious cant. That was an important call to connect the unbound determination of our people with the vital aid and guidance of God. America was determined to gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. The ideals or war goals of the anti-fascist allies, or United Nations. On January 1st, 1941, the United Nations of 22 countries around the world were formed into an alliance in order to oppose the fascist or Axis nations of Germany, Italy, and Japan. These United Nations, led by the Big Four of America, England, Russia, and China, signed the Atlantic Charter as a joint declaration by the United Nations and committed themselves to pursue the war with the aim of total victory against the fascist enemy. Over the next few years, an even greater number would sign on as members of the United Nations. The Atlantic Charter as the moral foundation of the new United Nations. The major guiding principles of this new organization, the United Nations, were to be those of the Atlantic Charter. This document would thus become a foundational document for the organization of that same name, the United Nations, that would be formed at war's end. The Atlantic Charter and Declaration outlined how an anti-fascist military alliance was to operate and how a post-war world would be shaped and also operate. The latter part would be particularly important in the way in which, after the war, much of the world would indeed take shape, especially economically. However, politically, the Atlantic Charter would ultimately prove to be much more idealistic than any of the great powers, when pressed for specifics, were willing to support at the end of the war. This was particularly the case with respect to the rights of national self-determination of people, the old Wilsonian ideal. Germany would lose a lot of its ethnic territory, which Poland would gain after expelling its German population. Russia's grab and absorption into the Soviet Union of the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the eastern half of Poland would be left unchallenged. Indochina would remain in French hands. Vietnam would not be granted the national independence it sought. Indonesia would remain in Dutch hands, etc. America gears up for war. America was back in business again, very focused on the clear goal of defeating, at all costs, the fascism that had destroyed the peace of the world. And, to get the job done, a much revived private capitalism was going to work very closely with Roosevelt's rather socialist state in producing the means to destroy enemy fascism. Under such cooperation, the federal government funded the building of new industrial plants, encouraged industrial producers to work together, and thus had to suspend the antitrust laws outlining just such behavior in order to optimize war production, much to the annoyance of FDR's New Deal supporters, who still considered industrial capitalism to be a vile philosophy. Industrial production got off to a relatively slow start, but picked up the pace rapidly. Automobile plants switched to war goods, such as Chrysler, which turned to the mass production of tanks. Industrial companies grew rapidly, and in the last years of the war were producing war goods at an astronomical rate. For instance, the Cow shipyards in Los Angeles in the last year of the war produced 247 Victory ships, more than one huge ship coming into operation per day. In Stratford, Connecticut, another industrial company alone produced some 6,000 Corsair fighter planes during the course of the war. With men entering military service in mass numbers, the country now found itself short in manpower and turned to woman power. The country's vocational schools turned to the converting of traditional secretaries, housewives, etc., into assembly line specialists, welders in shipyards, etc. Indeed, the Women's Army Corps had WACs, flying bombers from American assembly plants to airfields overseas, principally England, to put in the hands of the men who would then conduct the dangerous bombing runs over the German-occupied Europe. The war on the home front. Rationing. Even beyond that, all Americans were called to do their part on behalf of the men fighting for their nation. Scrap of all sorts, paper, rubber tires, tin cans, brass locks, scrap steel, even the metallic toothpaste tubes were collected for conversion into military material. Furthermore, food, which was being produced at a slower rate with so many farm boys in uniform, was rationed. Everything from meat to sugar to canned goods, virtually everything sold in the grocery store. Money made no difference in the amount a family could buy, because all families were under a point system of rationing, receiving on the basis of family size just so many points in coupons that had to be submitted with each purchase of food. Integrity on the home front. But by and large, the call to patriotic duty on the part of everyone was so strong that relatively little cheating or corruption found its way into American operations. But to make doubly sure, Missouri Senator Harry Truman headed up a congressional committee that examined closely the accounting books of the industrial companies that were receiving millions of dollars in government contracts for their war materials production. But amazingly, things ran on a quite clean basis, especially considering the vast amounts of money circulating because of war production. The internment of Japanese Americans. One sad chapter in the story of America's wartime government-society relationship was the 1942 Executive Order 9066, ordering 110,000 civilians of Japanese descent. Included in that number were 71,000 actual American citizens living along America's west coast, principally California, to be sent to internment camps, huge camps of bleak and depressing barrack-style housing, where these ethnically Japanese families could be contained. The program was justified on the basis that the Japanese had acted so treacherously in their attack on Hawaii that fear became widespread that the Japanese Americans might secretly be a part of a fifth column at home. Now, the fifth column was used to describe the large communities of German residents in neighboring countries which worked closely with Hitler's Nazis by purposely creating chaos in those lands so as to make the Nazi conquest of Germany's neighbors all the easier. The move is all the more shameful in targeting of Japanese Americans when German Americans and Italian Americans were not only not interned, but served quite readily in the U.S. military in fighting Germany and Italy. Actually, some Japanese Americans would enter U.S. military service, but in general, the internment of the Japanese Americans was widespread, causing these American citizens to lose their homes and businesses permanently. But the Japanese were amazingly graceful in the face of this huge betrayal of American democratic norms.